Christy Anderson is the producer of Zora Neale Hurston. The documentary film is called Jump at the Sun. It is on Amazon. Craig, you've recently watched it. How about playing a little Roger Ebert here for us, or Gene Siskel if you prefer?
I watched it on Amazon Prime, and it's really good. I thought I knew I knew sort of at least the broad outlines of Zora Neale Hurston's life as a writer and as a sort of a Florida icon. And there was a lot in there I did not know, things I was surprised to learn. I thought it really did a nice job of capturing her personality too, her sort of outsized enthusiasm and her ability to speak her mind. Yeah. There's one guy quoted in there who says, she could tell you to go to hell and you'd enjoy the trip, which I thought summed it up pretty well.
Great quote. Zora Neale Hurston, Jump at the Sun. Our guest is producer and writer, Christy Anderson.
How did you get interested in doing a documentary about Zora Neale Hurston? Had you read all of her books, or had you just read Their Eyes Were Watching God, or what?
I had actually not read a single book by Zora Neale Hurston. When I read a biography of Zora Neale Hurston by Bob Hemingway, who's a scholar, he mentioned film footage and he mentioned radio interviews, audio recordings. And as a documentary filmmaker, I thought, oh my gosh, here is this woman who's writing about the Black South, and she's actually going out and shooting film footage. That's what got me interested in it. And I was able to help the Library of Congress find some of the film footage that hadn't been located, just because I was so persistent.
Some of the film had been kind of sort of lost in the stacks. Is that what it was?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Margaret Mead had an office at the Museum of Natural History. She was going to make a Department of Anthropology or an anthropology gallery. And so every anthropologist around gave Margaret Mead their film footage and their whatever documents. And she never got around to doing that. But she did give a box full of stuff to the Library of Congress. And so when I started realizing, wow, we're missing some of this film footage that was shot in South Carolina of the church and the church service, I talked to the Library of Congress, this woman, Arlene Balkansky, and I said, is there any chance, where this is? And she said, well, all we have is these boxes, but some of the boxes of film say what the date is. And the dates coincided with the letters that I found that related to the project. So it was and that's part of the Library of Congress's most important films that they have is Zora Neale Hurston's films.
Why are they considered so important?
For one reason, not very many people were interested in the Black South when Zora Neale Hurston decided to document it, not just taking photos and film footage, but actually gathering their folklore and gathering their folk tales. Nobody thought these people were worth documenting. And Zora Neale Hurston did, luckily for all of us, because there's not a treasure trove. There's some footage out there of Black folks in the cities, but not a lot of footage from when Zora Neale Hurston was shooting footage and gathering her folk tales. Because, Margaret Mead went to Papua New Guinea and Franz Boas went to Alaska. Well, Zora Neale Hurston went home. She went to the Black South, back to Florida. And she also shot in Alabama. She knew that there was value in these folk tales, these stories. She ended up with a camera from this woman, Charlotte Mason, who was funding during the Harlem Renaissance, different people like Zora. There wasn't a lot of people. I mean, you had to know how to shoot footage. With a wind-up camera, I've got one over here I could show you. You really have to understand your f-stops and all that. And so it was really remarkable that Zora Neale Hurston did what she did.
For folks coming to this material and this story fresh like I am, tell us about this film. How much was shot? When was it shot? And what does it show?
It was done very anthropologically. Even if they were taking a photo, they would have a piece of paper, I think, with their name on it or their age. She was almost recording those people as she would a photo. And then she recorded them playing games. And these are the kind of games, in your front yard that you play. These aren't games like a board game or whatever. This is 1928 when she's shooting this footage. So, she's really trying to capture something unique about these people and the towns that they're in, the buildings that they're in. Front porches. She would shoot somebody sitting on the front porch in a rocking chair. And she was trying to show a different life than what she had been experiencing in the Harlem Renaissance right before she left.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Zora Neale is associated with the Harlem Renaissance, but she hardly spent any time in Harlem.
You answered my biggest question about her, because she's always referred to as an author and anthropologist. And of course, the author part is easy to understand from the books. But I had always wondered, where does this anthropology title come from? And there it is, these films she shot around the South and Florida documenting these people.
Well, she was also trained as an anthropologist by Franz Boas, the father of modern anthropologists. So the old style anthropology said, white folks down here, native folks, and Franz Boas says all cultures have value. And he changed it to a horizontal ladder. So she was able, with that kind of confirmation of her ethnicity, of her culture, she was able to embrace what a lot of people really didn't see as culture. It's really interesting, too, because she's a Black woman in a car in the 1920s, very uncommon. She goes into the Black South and she pretends to be a bootlegger at one point, and the girlfriend of some guy and different things. And she was really, there could have been a gazillion things that could have happened to her that her life was in danger. And she had a pearl-handled revolver that she had under her seat, according to a couple of people who told me that. So she was trained as an anthropologist, and the later film session in South Carolina was funded by Margaret Mead.
How much of an influence on her do you think did her hometown have? I mean, she grew up in the first all-Black incorporated city in America. Her dad was a preacher and the mayor. Although she grew up in the rural South, she had a somewhat different upbringing than the majority of Black kids from that time.
That is one of the reasons why she was probably so unique. And Eatonville, being an all-Black town, you don't see too many Black and white deviations. I didn't get into my film with this, but she used to sit on the lamppost or the road post waiting for white tourists to come by so that they'd pick her up, because she'd, be on the side of the road, chasing them, and they'd take her around town, So she had a different experience with white people, or at least she says that she did. That's been challenged. At one point she goes to a doctor in Harlem. This is about what's great about Zora. She claims that her worst racist experiences were in Harlem. And, that was not the message that was being disseminated at the time by the Black intelligentsia. So Zora was, a mixed bag. She wasn't really popular. And that's why she dies in poverty. All her books are out of print within 5 years.
Amazing. I thought I sort of knew the Zora Neale Hurston story, and then I watched your documentary and went, wow, there's a lot here I didn't know about. But there's so many great little touches in there. I love how she would announce herself by saying, Queen Zora has arrived. Mm-hmm. And then her sort of partnership with Fannie Hurst, a popular author of the day, a white popular author, that was pretty fascinating as well.
Yeah, it must have been kind of humbling for Zora to have to be this woman's secretary, But as I point out in the film, she wasn't a very good secretary. So then she became the driver, and they drove all over. They went up to Canada, and, just the two of them together, it must have been an interesting time. The Black woman and the very notable white woman. She was the most well-paid writer of her time. Not Zora, but Fannie.
Fanny, yeah. And I'm surprised nobody has written a series of books where they go around solving crimes. I think that would be a great idea.
That's your job, Craig.
Yeah, historical fiction. It's like Sherlock and Watson or something like that.
That's an interesting idea.
Modern era.
Yeah,
Eatonville, for folks who don't know, is a small town in Orange County, about halfway between Orlando and Daytona Beach. What is Eatonville like today? I've not been there.
Well, it was really difficult dealing with Eatonville because people in Eatonville are just like Zora. They're hard-headed. I used to say, oh, I hate being this white person going to Eatonville. And my Black scholars would say, it's no different with us. They are very much isolated. They're very proud of their history and who they are. But then on the other hand, they're always getting involved in like election fraud or something like that. And
well, that's the Florida part. That's the Florida part of it.
And, here's another Florida thing, Craig. They really came to some prominence when they were trying to expand I-4 and wanted to go through Eatonville and take some land away. And so journalists like yourself did stories, and they were able to stop the expansion of the highway. So they were interesting people. They were up by your bootstraps kind of people. And I was lucky enough to have them ask me to come and show my film a couple of times. So there's some footage that we think is Eatonville, but then you don't know. It's a footage, with orange groves and people with barbecue stands in their backyards and stuff. So it's funny how I'm not sure. You don't know exactly where the footage is that she shot, except her footage of Cujo Lewis, the old slave that was the focus of Barracoon, her most recently released piece of literature.
Yeah, that was intriguing. At the end of the book, not to jump around, but at the end of the film, where you had people talking about how she died, and she'd been frustrated by writing these novels that nobody wanted to publish, and people started burning her manuscripts, and a deputy sheriff said, wait a minute, I think I remember that she's a writer. Maybe we shouldn't burn this stuff. Are there other manuscripts out there waiting to be published by Zora Neale Hurston?
There are 3 missing manuscripts that I know of. Everything was so touchy when I was doing my film. And one of the things I don't mention is that the sheriff who puts the fire out says that he then turned these over to a particular person in Eatonville, and he remembered that there were some manuscripts there. So for a while, I was chasing down those people, trying to get those manuscripts if they existed. But we do know she wrote one about Madam C.J. Walker, who was a hair straightener in Harlem.
First Black millionaire, if I remember right.
I do know 3 novels and manuscripts in particular. Who knows what size they were, but she talked about them and she pitched them, but they didn't exist. And then there's one that is at the University of Florida, and it's Zora's last days. She's suffered a stroke. She's still writing. You can tell, though, that the spark isn't there. The narrative isn't there. It's a jumbled mess. And it was about Herod the Great.
The other thing I learned, I didn't realize that she had written Their Eyes Were Watching God, her most famous novel, in Haiti in like just a rush, that she just felt like she had to get it out.
I think it was 7 days.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And after having this, having broken off this relationship with a younger man, that I guess was sort of the basis for Tea Cake.
Zora was so funny. She's like having this, she married this one man, and their divorce papers, because she was like, and the divorce papers, they're describing her going around and practicing voodoo, on his property to jinx him. He said he had no idea that she'd lied about her age. And she was I'm trying to remember now.
I think you said she was like 48 and he was 23 or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, boy, what a lie that had. He just didn't know what 48 looked like, I guess.
And he claimed that was voodoo. That she voodooed him so he couldn't see straight.
Right, little conjuring there.
You mentioned that Zora died penniless. She was not a celebrity or anything approaching it when she died. And your film, in fact, came out in 2008. And before we started recording, you said it has received more attention in recent years than when it was launched. What do you think her renaissance is owed to?
I could say my film. No, when I started working, other people were working. That one novel that I mentioned, reading, I mean, it wasn't a novel, it was a scholarly book, a literary biography. He was an interesting guy. He's deceased now, but he had gone around the country in a Volkswagen van. And I even heard he had like 11 children.
Oh my! This is Robert Hemingway, the guy who wrote the biography.
Yeah, and he really was able to kind of ferret out a lot of information that looked at her literature. That a lot of stuff was missing. A lot of the things that have been released, he mentions them in his books. There's just a whole different understanding of Zora, and so with that book, then there became more people who were interested. It was kind of like the book left a lot of unanswered questions, and people wanted to kind of, fill in those blanks. And I felt the same way. Like I never really quite understood yet, even after reading his book, why she died in poverty. He doesn't go into the controversy very much, but Zora was out of step with the time, in the civil rights movement. She felt Black culture was just fine the way it was.
And now isn't that the biography that also sent Alice Walker looking for her grave?
Yeah. And Alice goes to Eatonville. No, she goes to Fort Pierce. No, actually, I think she went to Eatonville first looking for Zora, and they sent her to Fort Pierce, where Zora was buried. And she lies and says that she's Zora's niece. And Zora did have a niece about the same age, but that's kind of how Alice began. And then Alice printed or wrote a piece called Looking for Zora, I think. And it was published in Ms. Magazine. That kind of helped to start a renaissance. Another thing that I was told is that by one of my scholars is that Black women would take their Eyes Were Watching God, and it wasn't in print, and they would Xerox it and hand it to each other.
Oh, wow.
Really?
And so while publishers didn't quite understand what, Zora Neale Hurston was all about, Black women did.
She died in 1960, and you mentioned or referenced briefly that she was out of step in some sense with the civil rights movement and Black culture and opinions on both. Explain that in more detail, what exactly you mean there.
After the Civil War, Black people were being called upon to prove that they were human, that they could read, that their art was important. And so during the Harlem Renaissance, this was a time when there was hope for what W.B. Du Bois called the talented tenth. And this is after there was this feeling that the only thing that Black people could do was work and labor. So there was an effort to assimilate. Assimilating into white culture meant leaving Black folk from the South, former slaves, behind. They were not what anybody wanted to be represented by. They're dealing with lynching. There's people getting lynched, and nobody seems to understand that they're human. And that was one of the literary goals of this movement in the Harlem Renaissance, was to get across to people that Black people are human. And so
she treasured,
right.
Yeah,
Her portrayal of Black folk was not what the intelligentsia wanted. And she rarely stepped away from portraying Black people as, she didn't portray them as cityfied. They were folksy. They spoke in dialect. In fact, this one wonderful anthropological piece talks about their language and how they, would invent words. Well, that's not what people thought was fine. They wanted Black people to be speaking the King's English. And Zora Neale Hurston, and then beauty. She talked about beauty. She goes into this house and there's a bunch of calendar pictures cut out, pasted on a wall. And she says, that's beauty. It's too much beauty. There's like black beauty is an idea of there can never be enough beauty. These things that she came up with were so ahead of her time. Even at that time, they're not thinking that Black songs, other than the songs that are the field songs that are the Fisk Jubilee singers are doing these wonderful kind of spiritual sort of songs. Zora Neale Hurston is interested in Move It On Over and
Uncle Bud.
Uncle Bud. Uncle Bud.
Uncle Bud's a man like this. He can't get a woman, gonna use his fist. Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud. Oh, I'm going to town, gonna hurry back. Uncle Bud's got something I sure do like. Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud. Oh, little cat, big cat, a little bit of kitten, gonna whoop their tails if they don't stop shitting. Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud, Uncle Bud.
She kind of, she would speak up too. And so that was the problem. Zora had an opinion. She was strongly outspoken. And during in particular, when the Supreme Court decided to integrate the schools in 1954, Zora Neale Hurston had a treatise published in a newspaper saying this is demeaning to Black people. Now, I did some research and I found that there was more opposition to the integration of schools by letters that were written to like the Pittsburgh Courier and Black newspapers. But, in general, there was a feeling that she was keeping the Black folk down.
You talked about there was some opposition. Integration is a good goal morally and ethically and so forth, but it resulted in some bad things happening to the businesses that catered exclusively to Black customers. She was sort of on that side, I would guess, that she felt like if you integrate, what happens to Black culture that has flourished under segregation?
In particular, Black schools.
Although I think her argument was wrong about that, because she was contending, as long as everything's equal, what's the problem with having separate schools? Well, they're not equal. That's the problem.
Yeah, she kind of made up her own reality.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that was the case with her autobiography too, right? Death Tracks on the Road. Did that give you some heartburn in trying to piece together a film about her with a memoir that's full of stuff that she made up?
I tried to deal with facts. It's interesting, Craig, because we wanted to have Zora's voice in there as much as we could and be true to who Zora was. So that's why I chose a lot of times to use her words. When you're doing a documentary, you'll interview people, and sometimes they've got a lot of stuff wrong, or they say things that you don't agree with. But the bottom line is they are convinced that this is what they want to be known for saying and be in the documentary for. So there's a few things that I felt weren't exactly true to fact, but they helped to kind of give a little controversy to the film, but it wasn't a far stretch.
It was interesting to me that the sort of the structure of the movie, where you've got stuff that's very clearly, her footage that she shot and people that knew her talking about her. But then you've also got this sort of recreation of her doing a radio interview that helps to kind of tie it all together. I thought that was very inventive. How did you come up with that?
Well, one of the things in documentary is you have to use film footage or else you just got talking heads. And, you can use photos, but film footage can really recreate a time. Unfortunately, we were unable to find any audio that would sync to the footage. And some of it, you just work with it. And, you're really, maybe that's a little artistry going on. You're really trying to bring your viewer immerse them into an experience. So you edit things, and I think there's a little piece at the beginning of the film where Zora's walking up to this church, and we got her talking about cornbread. And it's a little tiny snippet, and nobody could tell that, well, at that point, there really wasn't any audio, but it's just the way she's talking, and you've got to dub over natural sound and things like that, just to make it seem more realistic. But that's why we did the reenactment. It was actually her words. And we went back and forth. Should we use her words and make an actor lip sync? And we kind of felt that was just an impossible thing to pull off. And so we had our Zora actor, Kim Brockington, who still does Zora in different she's in theater in New York. We had her actually use Zora's words.
She was really good. I liked your narrator, who everybody knows from Law and Order, and Reba the Mail Lady from Pee Wee's Playhouse.
Yes.
Esapatha McCurson, isn't that how you say her name?
Apatha Murkerson.
Yes, she was really good.
Actually, Apatha Murkerson.
That's it. Yes. Thank you.
She was delightful.
You have some really big names in there talking about this stuff. Were those all interviews you guys lined up, like with Edwidge Danicat and Henry Louis Gates, or were those?
It's funny that you would mention those two instead of Maya Angelou and Alice Walker.
Yeah, well, and Dorothy West. Dorothy West, too.
Oh, Dorothy West. That's really unbelievable. I found Dorothy West's phone number in a phone book. And you know how long ago that was, right?
Wow.
Because I started that film in 1989.
Oh, my gosh.
And I called Dorothy West, who was living in Martha's Vineyard, Oak Bluffs, which is an old African-American community. And Dorothy's family had been wealthy, so she could afford to, but she had this little tiny house with a wood-burning stove. I don't know if she lived there all the time. Dorothy, I called her up, and we're like talking on the phone. And, I've called her a few times. I said, we're coming to interview you. And as soon as we're in Atlanta, the crew, on our way, because we stopped and did some interviews there, I get this phone call from her caretaker. And she says, Dorothy's not going to do the interview. What? And, we're on our way there. And I said, well, we're still coming, what do you say? And I've got a crew, and this is a film crew. Oh my gosh, they were like thousands a day. But when we get there, she says, well, okay, Dorothy will do the interview. Henry Louis Gates, I met him in Eatonville, and he was not what he is now. He had, in fact, I don't think he was at Harvard. I think he was at Duke. He was a real Zora fan. I started working with the family, the Hurston estate. Everything sort of dovetailed. Who else did you mention? Oh, Edwidge. Oh my gosh, Edwidge was so wonderful because we felt like she completed the circle. She's the next heir apparent to the celebrated Black woman writer. Right. And I can't remember if I just called her, but we went through a period of time where we didn't have any money. And I had contacted her ahead of time, and she was like, oh, yes, I'll be happy to do anything for you. And she was living in Miami.
She still is.
Yes, yeah. She still lives there. We filmed her and interviewed her finally at the end when we got some more funding at her house in Little Haiti, which is also called Lemon City now.
These are all interviews just for the film. These are not interviews you guys were taking from other sources.
These were not. our Alice Walker film. Now, I was working with Sam Pollard. He was my director, and Sam is he was the Spike Lee's editor for many years from the beginning. Sam had interviewed Alice for a series he did for PBS. So that was in the can, and it was available through an archive. And then Maya, I can't remember where that came from, but that was also canned. But Alice said, I don't want to be interviewed. I've told this story over and over again. And I felt it was really important to get her interview. And we finally figured out we could use that one. And it worked out great.
Zora Neale Hurston at different points in her life lived in Jacksonville with family members, and I'm in the Jacksonville area, and we're very proud of that connection. How much detail in the documentary did you go into with her time in Jacksonville?
Well, in Jacksonville, that's when she was married to the very young man whose father had been the founder of the African American Insurance Company.
Which founded American Beach.
Lewis, yeah.
Which founded American Beach.
Mm-hmm. She had a brother who owned a butcher shop, I think, in Jacksonville. Her whole family, she had a brother who was a surgeon. She had a brother who was this entrepreneur in Jacksonville, had this established shop. She had a brother who was a pharmacist. She had a brother who was a mail carrier. And she had a brother who worked for the railroad in Bradenton. And her sister, Zora ends up going to stay with her sister in Baltimore. And her sister had a big house that she'd rent out rooms that had a dining establishment in it. And then Zora, when she went up there, she opened a little, a lot of this is just not in my film. You can't get it all in.
Yeah.
She opened what they called a confectionery, which I was told there's a place where you buy cigarettes and candy.
And Zora opened that? She ran that?
She was there then. And we went to the city directory, and there was a listing for, I think it was called Hurston and Allen, or Hurston and something, Hurston and Turner, or something like that. It was a little shop. It didn't actually say that it was Zora Neale Hurston. I can't remember exactly what the link was, other than she's there at the same time. It's in a Black district that sadly was gone the way of urban removal. I can't remember all the links to that, but we felt pretty confident that it was Zora. Instead of Zora Neale Hurston, it was Zora something else Hurston. Mm-hmm. And she had gone up to Baltimore at that time with a traveling theater group, or at least that's what she said. I could never find any proof of that. I always tried to be a journalist about it, because I am.
Were there any films of the performances of some of her plays, like Mulebone, the one that she co-wrote with Langston Hughes and then took his name off of it?
Clever girl.
Well, I didn't know if anybody filmed them while they were being performed. Yeah.
No. She performed them in Winter Park at that, what's the university? Rollins, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Rollins College.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She was close with the president there. She must have been quite a character. And she also performed it in Chicago at sounds like a YMCA or something. But no, nobody ever, if somebody recorded them, we certainly don't have that. There are photos, as I used one photo that was definitely from the Library of Congress, from her Sun to Sun Singers, I think is what it was called.
You've got some great photos in there, pictures I've never seen of her before. Was it hard to track those down? I have
an exclusive on some of those.
Wow.
And the reason why is Zora was married 3 times, and I met the daughter of her first husband, who actually was a surgeon also. He was in medical school. She was out in Watts. We got to be good friends, and that's how I got the photo. There's a photo of Zora and that man, Herbert Sheen. Yeah. And that's the only photo of Zora and him. And there were other photos as well. And so I had to agree that I would not distribute those photos except in the film.
She died in sort of an obscurity, but she's had this sort of, Zoranance, I guess you'd call it. Why do you think her writing and her message has persisted and even sort of grown in popularity?
Well, I think there's more of an appreciation for our folk roots. And I think, as Henry Louis Gates said, and I don't know if he said it in the film or not, sometimes it takes a long time for a book to be embraced. And it took a long time for Zora's book to be embraced because there's a limited white audience that's interested in what was maybe perceived as not racist, but stereotypical Black folk out and, poor and speaking in dialect. And for African Americans, I'm sure if you grow up, and that's why some of them are returning to the South, if you grow up feeling like, no, I can't, I have to separate from my past, then the next generation comes along and they want to know about that past. And Zora Neale Hurston did such a great job of documenting that culture. Nobody else could have done it either. So we're very fortunate we have her works today.
The documentary is Zora Neale Hurston, Jump at the Sun. Our guest has been Christy Anderson, who produced and put the film together. You can find it on Amazon Prime. I will put a link, of course, in the show notes.
Explain the title of the film.
That comes from what Zora's mom used to tell her, jump at the sun. And it was her mom telling her, you can do anything, you can be anything, jump at the sun. And that's actually used, a lot of people have written in books about it. And I think if you think about Zora, it fits just perfect.
Great. Thanks, Christy. We appreciate it.
Thought I heard somebody say, you're nasty but you're stinky, but take it away. Oh, you're nasty but you're stinky, but take it away. I do not want it in here. Oh, I'm so glad that the law is passed. The women in Tampa got to wash the ass. Oh, the women in Tampa got to wash the ass. Oh, I do not want it in here. Oh, thought I heard somebody shout. Horse up the window, let the stink go out. Oh, horse up the window, let the stink go out. I do not want it in here. Oh, just I heard somebody say, nasty but stinky, but take it away. Ah, nasty but stinky, but take it away. I do not want it in here.
I was not familiar with Zora Neale Hurston before starting this podcast. And Craig, you bring her up constantly, rightfully so. What is your attraction to her and her story and her work?
Okay, so you know how people talk about, I remember exactly where I was when such and so happened, when the moon landing happened, that kind of stuff. I remember where I was the first time I read one of her books. It's sitting in an auto repair shop, a muffler repair shop in Pensacola in the mid 80s.
So all good stories start, sure.
I know. And I had, I knew I was going to be there for at least 3 hours. So I thought, well, let me take a book. Oh, here's one I haven't been able to get into before because it's in dialect, but maybe I'll be able to do it. And I start reading it and it just sucked me in. And they came out and said, Mr. Pittman, your car's ready. Yeah, give me a minute. Give me a few minutes. I don't want to put the book down. It's that good. And the muffler shop and everything, all the noise and everything just kind of faded away. And I got sucked into this story about this woman growing up in small town Florida and her journey through life and all the things she had to deal with. And especially the scene with the hurricane coming across Lake Okeechobee and waking it up like a monster to flood these towns. It's just an incredible experience reading that book. And so I said, I need to know more about this person. And the more I've learned about her, and I learned an awful lot from Christy's documentary, it continues to show what a talented and smart and inventive writer she was. She alluded to, going into places where her life was in danger and just reading about that, her talking about, that she would go, she went into this one camp where somebody thought she was, of course, trying to get stories from people for her folklore collection. And some woman thought she was actually flirting with her boyfriend and whipped out a razor to come after her. And another woman in the camp who had become Zora's friend basically said, get out of here. I got this. And they started wailing on each other and the whole place erupted in a huge fight. And she kind of she wielding her pearl-handled revolver, she snuck out and jumped in her car and drove off.
What was the title of that book that wrote
I think that's from Dust Tracks on a Road. She sort of created herself, and she's an amazing creation, and her books are terrific. I would probably say she's my favorite Florida writer, just ahead of John D. McDonald.
Wow. Wow.
So.
High praise. If